starting right now. Ah, until 12:15. I understand. Good morning. I was not expecting to make an opening statement, but let me state the obvious. The actions by Russia in Ukraine have posed the most direct challenge possible to the fundamental rules of the European security system that was established after the Cold War with the full and willing participation of the Russian Federation itself. The Paris Charter of 1990, in fact, concluded with the Soviet Union. The founding documents of the OSCE, the Budapest Memorandum, thanks to which Ukraine, which then possessed the third most powerful nuclear force in the world, unilaterally disarmed. And what people forget in this discussion is the Russia-Ukraine State Treaty of 1997, which unequivocally recognized Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and current borders, and which raised no conditions about Ukraine's constitution or internal arrangements. And it is worth underscoring that between the signing of this treaty in May 1997 and the departure of Viktor Yanukovych from power on 22nd of February 2014, the Russian Federation has not once in any international forum raised a complaint against Ukraine in connection with the treatment of either ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. So the international community is now expected to accept that between the 21st of February and the 18th of March, a threat of such enormity and magnitude arose in Ukraine to justify the invasion and partial dismemberment of this country. If this challenge is not understood properly and its significance is not appreciated, the consequences go well beyond Ukraine. They affect European security as a whole. Ukraine is not the only country that has Crimeas. There is Pridnestrovia, whose de facto authorities have now issued exactly the same appeal to Russia for unification with the Russian Federation. There's a Russian community in Narva. There is the capital city of Latvia, Riga, with a strong Russian majority and an elected mayor who works in close collaboration with the political leaders of the Russian Federation. So if there is nothing to prevent what has happened here from happening somewhere else, whether something else happens is, at the moment, entirely up to the calculations of Moscow. And that will be the case unless and until some counter force, some counterbalance is erected that makes further action impossible. The conflict and the crisis here also have global implications. And this is understood abroad. First, it has direct implications for the regime of non-proliferation, for the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its enforcement. Second, some very significant players abroad, China, Japan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel are watching how Europe reacts in response to a threat to its vital interests, which are, of course, Europe. And the West and the United States reacts in response to a fundamental challenge to NATO and its wider security system and partnership relationships. And conclusions will be drawn if that response is not seen as adequate. Japan today has relatively limited interests in Ukraine, but I can assure you from my own working contacts that the Japanese are extremely concerned about what happens here, because they know that Beijing will draw conclusions from what is happening here. So this crisis is not simply about Ukraine. It's about all of us. And I hope it still remains to be seen whether we respond accordingly. So at that point, I'd be perfectly delighted to take any questions you might have. It would be helpful to me if you would introduce yourselves. I realize I don't have a headset. Я могу без труда понять вопросы на русском языке, но пока, к сожалению, украинский язык не под силу. I am not an engineer, I'm an expert in something else, so let me first, here we go. Okay, there we are. Я готов, I'm ready. Any questions, please?
Harvey Carroll, you mentioned that China is watching this. With, quite frankly, a huge assimilation of population of Volgograd being Asian, that would almost give China the same precedence to go into southern Russia and take those provinces if they use that precedence. So I can see how important it is for Europe. You know, I don't think Japan would be worried about the island so much as the mecca of industrial sales and trade into Volgograd.
I am by no stretch of the imagination an expert on China. Let me explain what the connection is. There is a strong connection despite the fact that what Russia has done has caused displeasure in China because China, for very obvious reasons, is adamantly against the breakup of states and the use of force to break up other states. The reason it's important in the Pacific is that this is a test for the West of its determination to uphold treaty commitments and international law. And if the Budapest Memorandum is effectively treated as just so many solemn words and not a binding statement, then, first of all, in Europe itself, people will ask, well, at the appropriate moment, will the Washington Treaty of NATO be handled in the same way? Will there be a robust response? And the Japanese will ask, does our security treaty, will it also be upheld in the face of far greater potential threats and risks than Russia is posing to Europe? That's the connection. That's why everyone is watching this. Because if we don't treat our word as our bond, then the entire system of assurances and treaties is weakened. And we are then back to a much more anarchic world than the one we have constructed.
Колеги, чи є в когось ще питання?
Еще другие вопросы?
Does somebody have any questions?
I'm also support your thesis about that the violation of Budapest Memorandum will have a strong implication for the international system. And speaking of China, I also would like to stress that there is lots of territorial disputes in South China Sea, which with Southeast neighbors. So the question is, in your opinion, what is the cure apart from coercive measures? Because we see that the international norms and standards were violated, and there are no, at this point of time, there are no vivid instruments of how to resolve the issue. Thank you.
There are will in the West. And the second question is the ability of Ukraine to help itself and the willingness of Ukraine's new leadership to help Ukraine. These are the two fundamental questions, and they are intimately connected. Ukraine has the most responsibility and must take the most risks in its own defense. This is true of any country. And although the circumstances are very different, I'll just remind you of one historical analogy. In 1914, when the United Kingdom was considering whether to honor its guarantee to Belgian neutrality, the question on which everything turned was, is Belgium defending itself? And when the answer was clearly yes, that made up the mind of the British cabinet. So there is a great danger today of what, in Russian we would call дополняющий эффект взаимного колебания, the reinforcing effects of mutual hesitation and timidity in both Ukraine and the West. So the Western side of it, when I say political will, this means ultimately a willingness on our part to change our priorities. We've changed our rhetoric. To change our priorities. Now, at one level we have, because we are already providing far more economic assistance to Ukraine than a couple of months ago anyone was even willing to consider under any scenario. So this we're doing very well. Clear about those objectives. Those objectives are either to resubordinate Ukraine or break it up, and preferably do a mixture of both. If that's to happen, a deterrent and a convincing defense must be presented in Ukraine. That requires Western help. It requires a mixture of material, technical, and institutional help for armed forces and security services which have been systematically weakened and taken apart during the Yanukovych years. And we have to be willing to do that and not be afraid of doing that. And I think it would be very useful if some of that material assistance arrived here on aircraft, clearly labeled aircraft of the United States Air Force and Royal Air Force, which send a very clear message. Secondly, and alongside that, there needs to be a difficult decision in the West that we are going to raise our defense budgets to be able to strengthen the security of the whole NATO area. None of this is about a NATO-Russia conflict, but it is about providing Ukraine with the tools to defend itself, to fight its own battles. This is something we need to do. And there's a third issue, which is vital to security in the short term and longer term, and it has to do with energy. We need to plan now to have the short-term response to an energy emergency if Gazprom cuts off the supply again. And I do not see, and I never have seen, a possibility that Gazprom could cut off the supply to Ukraine without also cutting off the supply to some European countries. They tried to create this possibility earlier through the good offices of the gentleman who is now in Austria, by gaining access to Ukraine's reservoirs and storage facilities. But basically the two are interconnected. We need a strategy in the short term to deal with an immediate emergency, but the question then is, does Europe have the will to put in place a longer-term strategy that would diminish the EU's dependency on Russian energy by 30% in 5 years? It's eminently possible, but it means doing real things, spending money, and it also means that we have to be willing to spend more for the energy we consume, and then it's possible. Does the United States have the will to release more from its oil reserves, strategic reserves, and also shift its export patterns? And is this commercially possible? These are difficult decisions. But the biggest issue, again, the Ukrainian connection is the most important. Because today Ukraine is the most energy inefficient country in Europe. It consumes 10 times as much energy per unit of GDP as any country in the EU. And all of this is done to enrich an election, then Ukraine will not attract investment. Ukraine's own energy resources, which are enormous, will not be developed. The entire economy will not be run on a modern or competitive basis, and it will be very difficult to establish rule of law in the country. So the most difficult steps need to be taken here, particularly if you want EU help and you need it. So all these things need to be done, and they require a mixture of planning, and they require resources, and they also require, on our part as much as your part, a willingness to make sacrifices, a willingness to accept pain, and a willingness to incur risks. Please.
Okay, and the last question will be...
Hello, sir. Might be correct to assume that you were probably a long-time scholar expert about East European Russian politics. My question is, if we turn back the clock 4 months to December 10th, December 11th, was there any point in time when you yourself or your colleagues or people around this academic political circles might have foreseen exactly this situation today? Because it seems to me the Russian intentions with respect to Crimea and the eastern provinces of Ukraine has been around in the Russian press and articles written by nationalistic Russian writers for a long time.
Yes. Well, please hear my whole statement or you will think I'm boasting. I predicted virtually everything until Crimea was actually annexed. So I've always been arguing that Russia, the Russian leadership draws a direct connection between the survival of the post-Soviet system in Ukraine and the survival of its own system, that Russia connects the fate of Ukraine with its own, and that Russia has for 22 years connected its own security with limited sovereignty of neighbors. And very specifically, beginning last summer, I was writing papers and arguing that the association agreement was going to create a crisis with Russia because they would not accept it. Okay, and they would use economic coercion, which they did very, very blatantly in November, where they basically said to Yanukovych and Nazarov, if you sign this, we will break every bone in your body, and here are all the documents, and this will show you how we'll do it. My view, by the way, is, and it's not a generally accepted view, that Yanukovych wanted to sign this agreement because he believed he wouldn't have to actually honor any of its terms, but it would strengthen his own freedom for maneuver. And the Russians were determined that he not do it. And I think I was one of the very first people to say, and I did back in January, that Russian military, there's a high probability that Russia will now intervene militarily in Ukraine. And people I respect very highly at the time said, no, James, это очень маловероятно. Okay. But I did not predict Crimea. I did not predict the annexation of it because there's been no precedent. You see, if you look at all the Russian state documents, all the speeches going back a very long way, there is so much justification for everything that was done up until that point, but there's no mention of actually annexing territory. Well, one should have known, because at the same point, what between the Russian and Slavic ethnos and Western liberal universalism. And Putin has himself overseen and contributed much to this whole ideological position. And with that, this great extension of policy and Russian law to the protection of compatriots abroad. And by compatriots, of course, they don't simply mean Russian citizens, but it's very easy to hand anyone a Russian passport. They don't simply mean ethnic Russians. They, according to the law on compatriots, mean anybody who has been culturally influenced by Russia in the course of history and who lives in this wider space. So the ideological justification was there, but I was almost as surprised as everybody else when on 18th March they made this decision. We could now see retrospectively why they did it, because Putin very clearly wants to move as quickly as possible to create as many irreversible facts as possible, which are then impossible to challenge except by taking extraordinary risks. Which is one reason why the situation remains very dangerous. So I think I've been fairly good at this, but I've certainly not been perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sherr. Колеги, якщо є якісь додаткові питання, будь ласка, вже в приватному порядку, бо дуже напружена ситуація з часом. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, and good luck to you all.